Welcome to the Alden House Historic Sites presentation of the Mullins family, Money, Mysteries, and the Mayflower, with author and historian Kathy Atherton joining us today from Dorking, England. My name is Desiree, and I'm the executive director. Together with the Alden Kindred Board of Directors, we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Mullins Alden and their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. This is one of a series of virtual programs that we will be presenting during this momentous 400th anniversary of the Mayflower journey. The story of the Mayflower Pilgrims is a story of the saints and the strangers. We're very familiar with the story of the saints who embarked on the journey for religious reasons. This book is the story about 6 strangers from Dorking, where Kathy will take us back in time to the bustling 17th century market town famous for its poultry. We meet William Mullins, a successful shoe merchant, his now famous daughter Priscilla, the rest of the Mullins clan, and their neighbor and weaver, Peter Brown. It would seem the Mullins family had it all: 4 children, prosperous business, and a comfortable home. From their large house on West Street, the teenage Priscilla could walk out the door to visit numerous artisans and shops. So what made a successful man in his 40s, who is not a pilgrim, toss his life over and take his wife and 2 youngest children on a risky voyage to the New World? Kathy will help us explore this fascinating tale of life, love, and loss. After the talk, we encourage you to ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We also invite you to share your feedback about this program and suggest other programs you'd like to see by emailing director@alden.org. And now, from across the pond, Kathy Atherton will begin her presentation.
Well, hello, and good evening from England. And good afternoon to you in the US. This is the really bizarre situation. I'm talking to my own computer. Normally I'd be talking to a room full of people and I could engage with you and get some sense as to what you know about Mullins and the family already. Obviously we can't do that, so I'm just going to have to imagine you, so bear with me. If there's any scratching at the door, that'll be my cat trying to get in or out. Okay, so to make a start, I don't know how much you know about William Mullins and his party, so I'm going to assume it's very little. The basic facts are that 6 people from the small town of Dorking risked everything when they voyaged on the Mayflower in 1620. We know who they are. We know where they lived and what happened to them when we arrived. So when Susanna and I came to put together our book here, we thought this is going to be a pretty easy job, pretty straightforward. All we need to do really is pull the facts together and show what their lives were like, why they decided to leave. It didn't turn out to be that simple. Much of what we thought was known actually turns out to be pure speculation. There's material that appears in articles, it appears in books, but actually there are no facts behind it, that the evidence is conflicting or it's non-existent. And much of the mystery is concerning money, and that's why I mentioned that in the title to this talk. There's no mystery, of course, about what happened to the family after their arrival in Massachusetts. So I'm really going to concentrate on the before, as it were, on the town that they left, what their lives were like in the town. And that will hopefully give you some sense of why they might have decided to take this journey there. So why did they decide to leave? What do we know about the town? I'm just going to put a couple of pictures up for you. hopefully you can see this screen now. Okay, so Dorking, what do we know about Dorking in this period? Well, it was known as Dorking, and what you're hopefully seeing in front of you now is a map of Dorking in 1649. Where is Dorking? Well, it's in the southeast of England. It's about 27 miles from London, so that's a pretty long day's walk. It had about 1,400 inhabitants during this period. It's got several mills on the river, several inns, and it's got a fairly sizable church here. Lovely little church. This is St. Martin's. We know that that had been there since before the conquest because it appears in the Domesday Book. This particular church is about 12th century, and it's probably where Mullins and his family would have worshipped. And I say probably because that's one of the big mysteries, whether or not he was a dissenter, and I'll come on to that later. Now, the next slide here is probably where Mullins drank. Now, during this period, the water is not particularly savoury, so people tended to drink a lot of beer. It was safer, it was quite dilute. This inn here was originated in the reign of Elizabeth as the Queen's Arms. By the time Mullins and his family are living in Dorking, it's known as the King's Arms after James I. And it is a stone's throw from their house. So, you know, this is probably his local. A very large inn in the middle of the town centre. And on the left-hand side, you can see a pointed roof with a gable and an oriel window. That still remains in the town. Much of the inn has gone, but that it remains, and it has got the initials of the landlord who was landlord when Mullins was living there. So that's a direct connection that we still have to the 17th century. Quite amazing, really. His name was Edward Goodwin. Now that's the King's Arms. Now just a little bit further down the street, we have this building. It now bears the name the King's Arms, and it's still a hostelry and pub. You can still go and drink in there. This building would also have been known to Mullins in his family, although during his period it was a row of cottages. And if you look quite closely at it, you can see in the centre, ignore the bricks, the brick gable at the end, in the centre, a very low little cottage with small windows, and that has now become a pub. So the house, which I will come on to, that William Mullins and his family are thought to have occupied, is right in the commercial centre of this town. So Dorking is quite a small town, and this is where business would have done. It's a farming, it's a rural community. This is the market hall. Sadly, we don't have it now, but it was there in Mullins' day and it survived into the early 19th century. Above, where you can see the windows there, that was the town lockup, the town jail, and below was where all the trade was done. And that's right in the centre of the town. Now, this town was famous as long ago as Mullins' day for the cockerels. This is a particular breed. It's got the Dorking cockerel. It has 5 toes. It was very well known as a good eating bird, and all the farmers in the local area bred them, and they were sold at the Thursday market in Dorking, and then they were shipped up to London for the tables in London. It was said that you couldn't get a chicken in Dorking on a Friday. So that was big business. And just out of interest, just about every organisation in Dorking has as its logo to this day the 5-toed chicken. So that's just an example of that. So all these buildings were wooden framed and they were made using local oak. And the reason for that is to the south of the town, it's an area of very thick clay. That clay is very difficult to get wood across. It's rock hard in the summer and it's a swamp in the winter. To the north, you've got the chalk hills. They're very steep. So if you're building in this area, you're using local wood. You're not bringing it in from outside. And that's quite interesting and quite useful for historians because they were using oak. Now, oak has to be worked within a year, otherwise it gets too hard to cut. And so we know that any houses that went up using this oak would have gone up within a year of felling. And what we can do is we can analyse the tree rings in the timbers to these houses to tell when they were felled, which means we know when they were built. And that's absolutely fantastic, being able to date things, to the year. So I've got a few examples to show you of the sort of houses that were in the town during Mullins' time. Now this is Pear Tree Cottage. It's still there, obviously. And what you can see, the white bit that's all rendered and stuccoed, that's the original cottage. It will be timber framed. It's all been infilled with brick and painted over now, but if you look closely you can see that timber framing. It's also timber framed. You can see on the side wall, I think that's all been renewed because it all looks rather nice and neat. And the bay on the left hand side, that will have been added on later. It's all nicely tile hung. So most of these cottages were low ceilinged, very small windows, no porches. This is typical of the town at the time that the Mullins family would have been living there. Another rather nice example, just around the corner from the Mullins house, is this property. It's called Leslie Cottage. We know that it was built in 1560, and the reason we know that is that the person who built it got into big trouble digging clay out of the river to make the foundations for the house. And the problem with digging clay is, of course, it muddies the waters for everybody else who's using the water downstream. So we can date that house very well. And again, it's a low, small windowed property, timber framed there, and that would have been well known to Mullins because they would have had to walk down to the river themselves. So I've said that transport in and out of this area other than on foot was very difficult because of this heavy clay. And this means that it's not a particularly prosperous area. When you look at England at the time, Surrey actually is a fairly isolated area, not at all prosperous. Harvests are very unpredictable. The soil is not great for agriculture. So what that would mean for this town was that, poor soils and bad transport, it's not a great place to establish a business. It's not a terribly prosperous town. And I think that might have been a factor in why Mullins and his family might have wanted to leave. So before I move on to what we know about the family, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about local government, because it sounds terribly boring, but it actually has quite a lot of bearing on what we're able to find out. Now, Dorking at this time was part of the Manor of Dorking, and that's a local government area. What it means is the whole area is owned by the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful lords in the land. He owns land all over the country, so he's an absentee landlord. He's never actually here. But the use of the land and the behaviour of the inhabitants in the town and all the surrounding villages were policed, and they're regulated by the Lord's courts, and they meet every 2 or 3 weeks. And when the court met, every man and boy had to be there, and they were fined if they weren't there. And what's great for us as future historians is they kept a fantastic record of the business of the manor. So they kept a record of every time somebody died and inherited property, because they had to pay a fine to the lord of the manor to inherit that property. They kept a record of misdemeanors when people were fined, and property transactions if you bought or sold or mortgaged a house. So we have these fantastic records about anyone who had the money to be involved in this sort of transaction. So this is fantastic for us. So that's what we know about the town that they came from. What about the family? Well, here we are, William Mullins. This is where it starts to get a bit tricky, because we know the names of the Dorking party from William Bradford's account. We also know it from William Mullins' own will. But apart from that, we don't have a lot of detail. You don't put, the ages of your family or when they were born into your will. So who were they? Well, basically we've got William Mullins, the shoemaker. We've got his wife, Alice. We've got his daughter, Priscilla. Now, she's thought to have been a teenager. And we have a younger son called Joseph, and people have guessed that he might be anything between an infant to 7 or 8 years old. And then we've got their servant, Robert Carter. We think that he is under 21, that he's a minor. He doesn't sign the Mayflower Compact. That's probably because he was a youngster. And we've got Peter Brown, a weaver. And I'll come to why I'm including him within the family in a little bit. So here we are. We've got this model of William Mullins that's in the museum in Dorking. Here he is dressed in green. It's not what we associate with Puritan black. But you probably all know that the meaning of the word Puritan in the 17th century is very different from what we tend to think when we use the word now. We tend to think of people who are very modestly dressed and tend to avoid pleasure. But of course, it meant something quite different in the 17th century. So there he is. We have no idea what he looked like, obviously, but he's holding a pair of shoes there to signify that he's a shoemaker. So I've got an interesting little aside on shoes, actually, at this point, because 17th century shoes turn up all the time in Dorking. They're not particularly rare, in fact, all across England. Here's an example. This one is found in a window frame, not very far from where William Mullins was in business. And they were very often put into window frames, they were put underneath thresholds, and they were put up chimneys. Why? I expect some of you are asking. Well, the answer is to ward off evil spirits. There was in the 17th century a very real belief in the physical presence of evil and of the devil. And it was thought that a piece of clothing, particularly a shoe, put in places where spirits might enter your building would attract the spirits to those shoes or other pieces of clothing because they had the imprint of people on them rather than to the human occupants themselves. And shoes were thought to be particularly good for this purpose. It was very common particularly to put them in chimneys, because you can shut the window, you can shut the door, you can't shut down the chimney. So that was a vulnerable entry point. So they do turn up all over the place. And we've got a lovely little example turned up only a few years ago in a village called Newdigate, which is very close. And these are 17th century shoes. So again, we've got that direct connection, which is lovely, with Mullins's business and the 17th century there. So to return to our man, what else do we know about him? Well, we know he was born in 1572. His father was a shoemaker. His brother was a shoemaker. He grows up during the reign of Elizabeth. And of course, England at that point is under regular threat of war. So as a young man, he would have had to do archery practice on the green in the centre of town, and he would have been fined for not doing that. That had to be done every Sunday after church. And we also know that he was fined for not attending the manorial courts that I was talking about earlier in 1595. He was in his early 20s at that point. Now, I don't think we can probably read anything much into that. People were fined even if they actually had pretty good reasons for not attending. He may simply have been ill. We also know that he had 2 grown-up children. We know that from his will, Sarah and William. They were married, they were settled when their father decided to leave Dorking. And we know that he had a wife and 2 younger children, Joseph and Priscilla. And we also know that prior to leaving Dorking, he had a property in the centre of Dorking. And here we are. If you ever come to Dorking, you can see this blue plaque. I find myself particularly miffed by this plaque because it mentions William and it makes no mention whatsoever of Priscilla. Obviously, for those of you who are in the States, you know, Priscilla is the main act and she gets no mention here. I think we probably ought to rectify that. So he owns a prestigious house in the middle of Dorking. And this is a 19th century painting showing the area where that house was. Now, I mentioned the large inn, the King's Arms, and you can see that that is on the right-hand side, that big building. And then on the left-hand side of the picture is Pump Corner, and that's where the town water pump is. That's where everyone has to go and get their water. And then right in the middle, you can see a fairly large property with 4 pointed roofs, and that is the house that William Mullins owned. And it's on the road from Dorking out into Guildford, which is the next biggest town. It's right in the commercial centre of Dorking. It's within walking distance of the pump, the communal washing place, and the sort of premises that surround it are the butchers, the bakers, the weavers, the leather workers, the brewers, the tailors, absolutely bang in the commercial heart of the town. Now I've got a picture coming up, here you are, and this is the property today. Now you can see those 4 bays, the pitched roofs there. Now ignore on the right hand side the extension to that building, because that's modern. It's quite nicely done, fits in quite nicely, but it's not original. So what you're looking at there is 4 bays of quite a large prestigious property there. You can see at the bottom the shop premises. That's very much as it would have been in the 17th century. You can see one of those shop premises is actually open to the air. Now, they all would have been like that. They have all been extended outwards, so that's not how they would originally have looked. They wouldn't also have had the tile hanging. That comes along much later. But the key thing that I think you'll probably noticed already is the difference between this building and those small, rather lowly dwellings that I showed you earlier. You can see this is a bigger building. It's quite a prestigious building. It's got 4 stories. So that's quite an impressive building that he has got there. And a building that would normally have been built for rent, to rent out with premises for artisans and shops below, and residential accommodation above. So that's what we know about Mullins and his time. But what we don't know is, when did he marry? How many wives did he have? When were his children born? All of which I think are quite crucial bits of information that might tell us why he decided to take his family across the Atlantic. And I always assume that it was probably his decision rather than the youngsters. So that brings us really to the mysteries here. What we know actually raises a lot of questions, and Susanna and I set out to tackle them when we started writing this book. And this is a quirky little picture. That is actually Susanna and I dressed up as Priscilla and Mullins there a few years ago. We've put on a few years since then. Setting out on our quest there. What don't we know? Well, we don't know whether Alice Mullins was the mother of the 2 children. We don't know, where did a shoemaker get the money to buy that prestigious house in the centre of town? And quite a few questions follow on from that. We don't know whether Mullins and Peter Brown were related. Otherwise, why is he going? And I think the most interesting question is, was Mullins a religious separatist or not? Or did he have sympathies? Some of those questions we have managed to answer, and some of them will probably never be answered. But I'd like to give you a little sense of how difficult it is to do research in this period. And I should say that although I started out life working in the 17th century, my last 10 or more years, my research has all been in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I was slightly out of my depth. Susanna is a medievalist, so she thinks this is all far too modern for her. So we did engage the help of Jane Lecluse, who's the archivist at Dorking Museum, because she can read medieval Latin, and she also can read the 17th century secretary script, which looks like code otherwise. Other difficulties you have is spellings. There's no standard spelling during the period. So Mullins can be spelt with an I, it can be spelt with an E, it can be spelt Mullins. So, it's quite tricky. And most of the records that you need to look at are here. And here we have Arundel Castle. It is a fantastic castle. Anyone who has been there will never forget it. It's about an hour's drive away down in West Sussex. It is a medieval castle, an original medieval castle. It has been restored, and it can be visited by the public. To research there, you have to go and sit in a turret. It is freezing cold. It's very badly lit. I won't even tell you what it is like to go into the cloakroom there, positively medieval. And these are the Duke of Norfolk's personal records. They're not for public consumption, and they go back centuries. And so the documents come up damp. It's really quite interesting. But it makes for an interesting experience, but it can be quite difficult to track down what you want. So this is what doing research in this period is like. So going on to those questions. Was Alice the mother of the children? Well, there's a large age range, isn't there, between those older children who've grown up and married and the young child, Joseph. And that's given rise to that suggestion that actually this might be a second marriage. And I think that's quite possible, that Alice was a second wife and that Joseph was her child. There are real problems with tying down the Mullins children and the dates of his marriages. Firstly, there's a gap in the parish registers in Dorking for quite a period. Documents have simply been lost, and this happens, unfortunately. And there is no record of either of his marriages, and there are no records of the children's baptisms. And of course, people have leapt on this and said, well, obviously what that means is that he didn't baptize his children in the Church of England. It means he was a dissenter. Maybe. But a more simple explanation is that he had simply moved out of the area. And Caleb Johnson discovers him on a muster list in Guildford. It's only 10 or so miles away, so it looks as if at one point he has moved there, and then he moves back to Dorking. By that time he's already married and he already has his children there, and we don't have the parish records for that period, for that particular area, so we've drawn a blank on the ages of those children there. But I think the question of a second marriage is quite an interesting one, because it might give us some clues onto some of the other questions there. Particularly, how does a shoemaker, a reasonably humble occupation, acquire the money to buy a property as prestigious as this one there? Now, perhaps it's incorrect really to call him a shoemaker. My feeling is that he was probably by this time in business trading in shoes rather than being the man who is actually making the shoes. He's obviously quite successful. He takes a lot of stock with him on the Mayflower. He also has money back in England when he leaves. He has money to invest in the voyage. So where is that money coming from? And, we're wondering whether that comes from a second marriage. If he marries a woman of some substance, brings that to him, and the timing of that would make quite good sense given Joseph's age. Because if he buys the property, which he did in 1612, and he's recently remarried, perhaps that has given him, the extra income to purchase this very expensive property. And then he sells it again in 1619. That's just before he sets off for the colony. So if he's recently remarried and he has a young son, the two things, the purchase of the property and the birth of his young son, can come roughly at the same sort of time. But it's not clear cut. Again, it's speculation. But there are quite a few other odd things about that property transaction. Firstly, he took on an existing mortgage on the property. He bought it in 1612 for £122. It had a £200 mortgage on it. That means that he's paying £322 for it. That's not as odd as it seems, actually, because right through until probably the early 20th century, rather than entering into a new mortgage and a new loan agreement every time a new purchaser came along, they quite often took over existing loans. So that's not terribly odd. But the bigger mystery is when he came to sell it in 1619, he sold it for £280. Which means that he'd actually made a loss on it, which is a bit of a puzzle. Was he selling in a hurry because he wanted to liquidate his assets to invest in the Mayflower venture? Or was there something else going on? And that is a real mystery. Interestingly, Caleb Johnson thinks he got only 180 for it. Now, we went back to the original records. There's a smudge on the ink, very inconveniently at that point, but we're pretty convinced that it's 280. So again, why is he selling for 280? And we'll never find out that, unfortunately. It may be that it's part of a chain of transactions and the money was actually coming to him elsewhere. It might also have been that he was selling to family, and the Bothell family who bought the property from him was certainly reasonably related, slightly distant, but perhaps there's something of that nature going on. It's very frustrating because you feel that there's something more of a story here that we're just can't get the information on there. But the key question, I think, Mullins, is not financial, but it's physical. Did the family actually live here? And people always ask me when I do guided tours in Dorking, which bit did they live in? And my next slide actually shows you the Mullins coffee house there, which is one of the businesses, which is one of the bays there. And people are very keen that actually the family lived there. And I do absolutely hate to disappoint everybody because we really don't know. We have no idea. And there's another slight fly in the ointment, is that when he bought this property, it was said to be occupied. It was rented out. So there is a possibility that Mullins owned this property, but he never occupied it himself. Perhaps it was always rented out. And that would immensely disappoint everyone if ever that came to light. It's extremely unlikely that it ever will, because there are no records of occupiers. There tend to be records of owners. So we assume that he occupied at least some of it, but we can't be sure on that fact. So that is quite frustrating, but as far as we can go on that. So moving on to the third question that I raised, which was, were William Mullins and Peter Brown related? And there seems to be every likelihood that they were. Caleb Johnson accidentally came across Peter Brown and John Brown in the Dorking parish records, which was just by an amazing piece of luck, because as you can imagine, searching for someone with the surname of Brown, which is incredibly popular in England. There are probably Browns in every parish of the country. There are probably Peter Browns in this period in numerous parishes that we could claim is the Peter Brown. But Caleb Johnson came across Peter Brown with a younger brother, John. And interestingly, they seem to have lots of family connections with the Mullins family. And we do set them all out in the book. It looks very much as if the reason that Brown went is because he was very close to the Mullins family. In fact, his cousins owned property nearby to Mullins. And it's even possible that actually Mullins' wife was Peter Brown's aunt, so he would have been crossing the Atlantic with family. So the key final question that we really wanted to get to the bottom of is, was Mullins and his family a religious separatist? Did they have similar beliefs to the Leiden contingent, rejecting the structures of the Church of England, the prayer book, the priesthood, in favour of a more pure religion based on the word of the Bible? I.e., were they leaving because they've been repeatedly fined for not attending church, and possibly because their business was being impacted by their religious position? I think that's the key question that everyone would like an answer to. So as I've said, people tend to latch on to the lack of marriage and baptism records at St Martin's to say, well, obviously that backs it up. It does in a sense, but where records are patchy and people moved around, it doesn't really prove anything at all. Other factors tend to suggest that actually he enjoyed quite high status in the town. He wasn't doing badly. He owned this very prestigious property. He had multiple business interests. His will shows that he's still got assets in England even when he sailed. He's acting as executor, witnessing wills for other family members. In 1604, he also stands as a tithing man, which is a position of some responsibility in the town for his neighbourhood, which makes him responsible for the good behaviour of others. He takes his turn at that role, which is unlikely if he was being fined for non-attendance at church or if he was a known radical. So that would tend to undermine this. But there are some other unknowns that perhaps might back up this theory that he really was a religious separatist. In 1616, he appears before the Privy Council. Now, we tend to think that that is very serious. It's up in London, it's in front of ministers of state, that it must have been a serious criminal offence, but actually not so at the time. It could have been religious, it could have been criminal, it could have been a civil matter, a business matter. So he could have been called up, simply for a property or business dispute. And we really wanted to do what we could to get to the bottom of this. And we sent Jane up to the National Archives, which is almost polar opposite from Arundel Castle in terms of a very comfortable, well-organised place to research. But she still comes up with nothing. The Privy Council records for that period simply don't exist. It was explained to her that they had a clear out sometime in the 19th century to make more room, which is totally frustrating for us today. 1619, he comes before the Surrey Assizes, and their records look rather more hopeful. So we send Jane down to Winchester in great hope of what she can find out. There must have been some kind of criminal case. What was he involved in? Once again, she draws a blank, because whatever case Mullins was called for was dropped. And when they dropped a case, they dropped all records of it. They didn't record what the case was or why it was dropped. So in both cases, we drew a complete blank, and we don't think we will ever get to the bottom of what was going on and what these two court cases were about. And so the temptation is to surmise that both of those brushes with the law were on account of failure to attend church or dissemination of banned literature, something like that. But there's absolutely no evidence at all. And we have to bear in mind that he was a businessman and he had many dealings, and any one of his business dealings might have led to some kind of legal dispute. So there's quite a danger in reading too much where we've got no evidence at all. So that brings us to, if he wasn't religious, then why might he have decided to risk this very perilous journey? And I tend to be quite cautious, and I don't like to impute any sort of motives to him other than what we know. And what we do know is he took 21 dozen pairs of shoes. So that's 252, I think, pairs of shoes and some boots with him. Now, did he see a business opportunity? You know, he is living in a town that is not terribly thriving. If this colony is successful, he would have been one of the first tradesmen there. Of course, everybody needs shoes. He took a share in the company. He's likely to make a decent profit once this colony starts shipping back furs or timber. My own feeling, and I think Susanna's as well, is that he must have had some sympathy with the religious separatists and their beliefs. I don't think he could have agreed to sail with them under the terms that they're proposing, unless he had some sympathy, I think, with their beliefs and their wish to live the sort of life that they believe that the Bible required of them. But we know that there were tensions between those who put money in and the Leiden separatists. So I think it's a leap too far to assume that religion was his primary religion. So I'm sorry if you think that I've kind of recited a category of failure, really, to answer most of the questions that we set ourselves. And our investigations have left us with as many questions as answers. But that is the nature of research in this period. So I'm just going to finish off really with summarising what we do know, and that is what happened to the family and to Peter Brown on their arrival in Massachusetts, because I can't assume that everybody who's listening does actually know that. So forgive me if you do. Mullins, his wife, and his son and his servant all died pretty soon after arrival. They didn't survive that first winter. That left only Priscilla and the weaver Peter Brown alive at the end of that first winter. Mullins clearly knew he was dying because he wrote his will. And this is a copy of his will. It's not very clear. It's in this pretty unreadable secretary script of the period. It was pretty unusual amongst the colonies to have a will dictated, and I think it underlines how prosperous he was, because not only did he have his share in the colony, the property that he'd taken out there, but he also had money in England and money that was owed to him back in England. So he needed a will that could be proved back in England, so that his son and daughter could claim his property there. Obviously, there's no legal structure set up yet in the colony, so they're still subject to English legal structures. So that will goes back on the Mayflower when it returns there. So we know that he left his money to his wife and to his two children. And of course, his wife and Joseph didn't survive him. His oldest son, interestingly, back in England, did eventually travel to the colony in 1636. That's 15 years later. And he brought Sarah, who was Mullins' granddaughter, and she married 3 times in the colony. So the only one of Mullins' children never to end up in Massachusetts was his daughter Sarah, who remained in England. As far as Peter Brown's concerned, we know that he married a widow, Martha Ford. She arrived in the colony on one of the later boats. She had a newborn baby and a young child, and her husband had either died on the voyage or very shortly afterwards. Peter Brown and Mary settled. They had 2 children of their own before she died. He married again and had another 2 children. He survived 13 years in the colony. So obviously he then leaves quite a large family of small children and stepchildren. And we know that he was joined in the colony by his brother John, also a weaver, and we know that because he took charge of 2 of Peter Brown's daughters. And perhaps not surprisingly for a weaver, he had a large stock of sheep in the colony. And he called one of his daughters Priscilla, and my initial thought was he must have named her after Priscilla Mullins, the only other survivor from that Dorking party. But actually, looking back through the Brown family, that name Priscilla crops up time and time again, which is another factor that leads us to believe that they were all related, because it's not a terribly common name, and certainly wasn't at the time. What happened to Robert Carter, the servant? Well, we know that he was a young boy. We also know from Mullins' will that his master was pretty disappointed with him. He asks the elders of the community to keep an eye out for him. So I don't think that the relations between them were terribly good. In the end, they didn't have to, because he followed his master to the grave fairly soon afterwards. So that leaves Priscilla left alone. By the end of that winter, only one of 4 or 5 adult women in that colony of 50 people, all the rest adult males and children. And that's because there were far more male passengers on the Mayflower. Many families took their men servants, and many families left the women and children behind to join at a later date. And that first winter took a greater toll on the women passengers than the male passengers. So she's one of only 4 or 5, and one of the only marriageable women in that colony. And of course, you have got a large number of bachelors and widowers looking for wives and mothers for their children. So that leaves her as quite a catch, really, because not only is she one of the most eligible women, but she has her father's money, and of course that will bring her husband considerable status, I think, in the colony. And I think it's interesting that she didn't choose to marry one of the older, more accomplished, more established men in the colony, but the ship's cooper, the young John Alden. So she must have seen something in him. And the rest, as they say, is history. Of course, they went on to have 10 children, absolutely fundamental to the establishment of the colony, was populating it. Hence our title really to the book there, Priscilla Muller, Mother of a Nation. And that's where I will finish. I hope that has answered some of your questions and given you a bit of an insight into how we went about the research, and doesn't disappoint you too much at what we couldn't find out.
Kathy, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. There have been many comments that are being posted, and at this time, we do encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A section there, which you find at the bottom. So we're going to try to do a little back and forth, I get the fun of just asking the questions. Kathy has to answer them. So bear with us as we go ahead and get started here. All right, so the first one up here is, what in the will surprised you?
I think it surprised me, actually, how much he had to leave, actually. Yeah, because I saw the will fairly early on, before it started to look at the property scenario and the large sums of money that we were talking about. It also surprised me that he seemed to have some assets back in England, and that made me wonder about his thinking. It still makes me wonder, because the colonies up to then had been fairly unsuccessful. After the Mayflower colony and other colonies became established, there seemed to be a lot of traffic then going back and forth between England and Massachusetts. And we know that Mullins' son came out and then he went back again. I'm wondering, was he expecting to stay in the colony, or was he expecting to set up and actually return, that he had left some of, some debts and property in England?
And so next one, how many shoemakers were in Dorking around 1619, around the time that they left?
The answer to that question is that we can't possibly know. It's a very difficult one because the earliest map that we have of Dorking is from 1649, which is 30 years afterwards, which has a lot of this sort of information on it, who owns land, what their names are, often what their occupations are. That's obviously 30 years later. And so we really can't tell. And the difficulty with dealing with these sort of records is, as I was saying, if you own land, it's being recorded in these court records. If you are committing a misdemeanor or a crime, it's being recorded. If you're going about your day-to-day business, not getting into trouble, and not buying and selling property, then you just disappear from the record. So it's impossible to say.
So another comment actually here is, do you know if they're descendants of her sister Sarah, who stayed back in England?
No, we don't, but we have people on the case. We have people in Dorking now who are trying, and the difficulty is, how exponentially, this genealogy works through the generations. But we have people who are trying to find that out. I mean, it would be brilliant if we can. Yeah.
Some requests for the photos, your beautiful photos that you included in this.
Yes.
From some of the, I do want to mention that they are published in the book, and if you want to get a copy of the book, I'll mention this again. Through special arrangements, we have copies that Kathy has shared, and they are available on the Alden website. But Kathy, you may have another way that you can share some of the photos.
Yes, I mean, indeed, we've got the JPEGs of the photos. I'm not quite sure how to facilitate that. I mean, yeah. Yes, I don't know if people could get in touch with you. We can work that out.
Sure, yes. Sure. And other questions for you as well. So here's how about what's your thought about truth in the Longfellow poem?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about that at all. That's right. I mean, it's supposed to be a family story passed down the generations. Who knows? There may be some truth in it. I have to say that Longfellow is a storyteller by nature, isn't he? That's his work. So it could be all complete fantasy, or it could be that there was a germ in there that he has taken and embellished. Yeah.
So how about, do you know if there are any places in Massachusetts to access their family records? And this is written by an ancestor.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know that. I have to say that I'm not a genealogist myself, so I tend to be quite reliant. We've been quite reliant on help for others on this. I'm quite good once you get into census records in the 1840s, but I'm out of my depth.
Right. I think going to the Massachusetts Historic Archives might be a good thought for maybe some of that, at least for the 17th century. So can you provide a little more history? The shoes are very interesting, Kathy. Can you provide a little more history of shoes in the walls?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? That the first time I came across it, I'd never heard of it at all, and now they crop up, all over the place. And the museum, we had a bag full of them at one point. They crop up all over the place. In fact, there's a project run, I think, by Leicester University, which are trying to record every instance whenever they turn up, and it went on. Right through into the 20th century as a superstition that builders did. I think they probably by then didn't even know why they were doing it. And you still find builders doing odd things like that even today. It wasn't just shoes. Slightly more gruesome was to bury a cat under the threshold. was commonly done as well. So it's not unusual in these old buildings when they're being renovated, and the builder will come and say, "We've just found cat bones under the threshold." But I think the idea, I've been told by someone who's made a study of this with shoes, is unlike other clothes, the shoes really retain the imprint of the occupant. You know, they take the shape. And so that's why they were felt to be more effective at attracting spirits. Yeah.
Here's an interesting question. Could Priscilla possibly have lived with the Peter Brown family after the loss of her family? I think he was single, though, still at that point.
Yeah, I don't
right?
think that was,
yeah.
Yes.
A big no-no, Linda.
I think William Bradford records who she went to live with, and it might have been William Brewster. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is in the book. It is recorded who she went to live with. Yeah, she wasn't left alone.
Do we know what Alice's maiden name was?
No, we don't, because we don't have that marriage record. That's the frustrating thing. And the interesting research that Caleb Johnson does, you know, he comes up with an Alice in this family who appears to, well, has been widowed. And, you know, one of the things he surmises is that she might be the Alice who married Mullins. But because we don't know Alice's maiden name, there's nowhere we can go with that.
Another question about what became of William's father and brother, who were also shoemakers. Any information about them?
Off the top of my head, I can't quite recall whether it's known when they died or not. I'm not entirely sure. They certainly don't seem to have followed William out. No. I'm not sure whether their deaths are known.
If Mullins was looking at the colonies only as a business venture, wouldn't he have left his family in England? And, you know, which was pretty common. Is that, you know, she just wanted to know if that was correct. Yeah.
I think that's a fair point, isn't it? Because,
yes,
a lot of those who travelled went and set up themselves expecting then to bring their families over, and he didn't. No, that is a fair point. Yes.
So back to the interest in William getting, you know, his brush with the law. There's a question about the Clink is saying that Mullins was locked up there. And can you comment on that? Is it true?
No, it's not true. No.
Okay. All right. So what else can be told about Priscilla's brother, William? Did he remain in the colony, and are there records of his descendants? Okay, yeah.
Yes, he had no descendants. Yes, he did, and he married in the colony, but he appears to have had no children. And similarly, his daughter Sarah, who is Mullins's granddaughter, married 3 times in the colony, but had no children.
Do you know of the ancestry of the Mullins, and how far back can you go?
I don't, because it was beyond the remit of what we wanted to do in this book. I do know of one person in England who has attempted to do that. Jane, who, as I say, is the museum's archivist, is a little bit dubious about some of his research. So I don't think we have anything that is, you know, conclusive. And it is very difficult once you get back to these periods to actually, you know, once you're out of, you know, the 19th century where you've got your censuses and very clear birth, marriage and death records, it is more difficult. So no, I can't comment on that.
What was the inspiration for this research and the book?
The 400th anniversary. Yeah. It was really, I mean, we've always known about this story in Dorking, and I lead guided walks in Dorking, and it's always a big feature. And the anniversary was coming up, and we thought, there is nothing actually in print that tells the whole story. There's a couple of lines in a book here, there's a couple of lines in a leaflet here. We need something that brings that together. I was very dubious that that was actually enough to say, but once we started looking at it, in fact, there was nothing really in print about what Dorking was like in itself in the period. So it was an opportunity to look at the town, to look at what remains of Mullins Dorking as well. And that's been a great offshoot from it, is that we now do specifically Mullins Mayflower related guided walks, where we take people around to see all these old houses that often people have lived in the town, and because they're down a side street, they've certainly never been down here. We had no idea that there is this beautiful old cottage. So it was an opportunity to look at the period and the town as a whole. So that was the inspiration for it. And I'm really glad that we did it, because the idea later this year is that we'll do an exhibition about the town in 1620, rather than simply retelling the Mullins story that's covered in the museum anyway. And look at what people were eating, what people were wearing, tying all those aspects of the town's history in. Yeah, so it's one of those things that was sprung on us, but has been really fortuitous. And everybody, in fact, in Dorking's got terribly excited about it.
Well, I can tell you, having read the book, that the maps that you included, just really brought the 17th century home, of a town at that time. It was so helpful. So again, back to the shoes. Why did William bring so many shoes and boots on the Mayflower? And was he expecting to sell them to the other colonists?
Well, I think he must have been. You don't need that many pairs of shoes for a family of 6. So clearly there's no other reason than that he was expecting to sell them. And I thought it actually does make a lot of sense. Everybody is going to need shoes. You can't work, you can't farm, you can't put up houses if you're not properly shod, particularly, well, I suppose they didn't know what climate they were going into, because they were actually fetched up in the wrong place. But even so, and, thinking about it, everybody, when they landed, it's all hands on deck, isn't it, to build the houses, to plant. You don't want your shoemaker away making shoes. Surely it makes more sense that he comes with a supply of shoes, and then he's an able-bodied man who can work. That was my supposition, that he has a stock of shoes that will see them through that first period while they're getting established.
Kathy, we've always wanted to go into Priscilla's closet to see what she had for footwear.
Oh, yeah.
Another question here. Are you a descendant of the Mullins?
No. No, I'm not even Dorking born and bred. I'm from Sussex, further south.
So here's a question. Actually, this is from Pauline Keyser. She's our board president. The picture you paint about William's life suggests he's not just a shoemaker. He seems to be an entrepreneur with many irons in the fire. Do you think this helps explain why he would take such a risk and go on this journey?
Yes, I mean, I think it does. He's described often as a shoemaker, but a shoemaker suggests the guy who's sitting there making the shoes. He's got these huge premises. He's got money all over the place. Either he's married money or he's been very successful. And if he's been successful at what he does, it would suggest that he's entrepreneurial, that he's probably taken some risks in his life. Yeah, maybe this was another one.
Mm-hmm. The will was signed by a Thomas Ridley. Who was he?
Let me just check that, because I think, yes, that's the oddity about the will, because it was witnessed by the ship's surgeon, the ship's captain, and I don't think anybody knows who Thomas Ridley is. I think it might have been something like the person who copied it. Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery, because there are two copies of the will. One has Thomas Ridley mentioned and the other one doesn't. So it may simply be the secretary at the probate registry, or its equivalent at the time.
So let me just take a quick look. So here's another question about the tourism. A great deal of tourism in Dorking now to visit the Mullins house, which your book states is the last known standing house of a Mayflower passenger. And you mentioned that wonderful tour that you now offer. So has that brought a lot of other tourism interest to your town?
Well, yes. If we weren't on lockdown, I think it would be fantastic. Yeah, I mean, we started the Mayflower tours in November, December of last year. And we found that, people were coming down from London, which was, it's quite a surprise, really. They don't for the normal, Dorking tours. We're also getting interest from people who are over from the States, and they've checked into the Mayflower 400 website, and they just, email on spec as to whether there's someone who can take them out. So, yeah, in fact, we had a whole schedule of tours on sale for the whole of the summer into the autumn, which all have had to be cancelled now. So we're cancelled right up till the 1st of July, and then we'll have a rethink and see whether it will be possible to restart them again. But yeah, so far everyone had sold out, which is absolutely lovely.
Yeah.
But they will restart, and they will be something that we won't just do this year.
Yeah,
it's the anniversary this year, but we will continue to offer them.
So where was the will stored when it went back on the Mayflower? And was it known since that time? Where did it go? It was probated back in England.
Probate. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the process, I know what the process for probate is now. I'm not sure exactly what the process was then. But probate would have been granted, and this is the other odd thing that I didn't mention. That one of these copies says that probate was granted to his daughter, and one says that it was granted to his son. Very odd. We can't get to the bottom of that one either. And they are now in the National Archives. So whoever dealt with the probate at that time, it's gone down through the centuries, and it's been deposited in the National Archives. Which is why we can see it now. Yeah.
So did any of John and Priscilla's 10 children become shoemakers? Oh, like their grandfather. I can tell you that I think one of them was a cooper. I have not heard about a shoemaker, but perhaps future research may reveal that information. Here's a good one for you, Kathy, about Dorking tourism. Any suggestions on where to stay when vacationing in Dorking after this is all over? And so we can walk and enjoy, walk in the footsteps of those pilgrims.
They'll probably be pleased with me for saying so, but there's an ancient inn in the centre of town called the White Horse. It has a 15th century timbers inside. The outside is mainly 18th century. It's got lots of character, and it's within walking distance of Mullins's house. So that's probably the obvious place to stay, with the most character.
I can definitely tell you, though, that you have to have coffee and cake in that Mullins shop. We've had a sample of that was brought to the United States, especially, and it was just delightful. So we highly recommend it. I think we've gone through, there's so many questions, Kathy, which we will share with you, but I think we've touched on most all of them. Again, we do want to tell you that this book is available for sale. It is offered through alden.org, the website. Again, it's a very special courier service that we have in these days right now. Kathy very kindly has helped so much to make that happen. I want to thank you so much for just this fascinating presentation. We've been so excited to be able to share this. The minute we first heard about this book, I also want to thank our board member, Terry Reiber, who's been literally behind the screens making all of this happen. Encourage you all to keep checking out our website for future talks. We are offering another one in 2 weeks. Interestingly named The Wicked Pilgrim. And again, thank you all so very much.